Hello, and welcome to Cutting Through. I'm Mitchell Plitnick. It is always dangerous to elevate the rights of one group over another. I mean, it leads to pretty much all the conflicts in one way or another that we see all around us in the world. Um, one group being privileged or being entitled over another group, it's it should be obvious to anyone that that is going to lead to problems. We also live in a world of political power, not one where respect for universal rights and justice abides. Therefore, we continue to see situations where, uh, you know, sometimes because one group is just seen as more worthy than the other, sometimes just because one group has more of an in with the powerful than another, or is just more powerful than another. But whatever it is, we see rights of one group of people elevated over another, you know, pretty often, pretty constantly, and to various different degrees. In really harsh conflict situations, that gets to an extreme degree. Many of us, I think, live with it in various ways in our day-to-day lives all around us. We can look at, some of the most extreme examples in a place like Gaza, to see what happens when that situation really gets out of hand. And when we're talking about conflicts and we're talking about different ethnicities that are going at each other, it also behooves us to ask what happens when each side perceives, rightly or wrongly, that their rights are infringed upon by the other group. In some cases, might even perceive it as being infringed upon by the other group's rights, that the rights are incompatible. So how do we deal with that? And of course, that's why we all try and build a system of international justice. We haven't done very well at that. But I think in this video, I'm going to discuss the question of the Palestinian right of return, and how that is being ignored because it is inconvenient, because it raises so many difficult questions. And what prompts this, as some of you may be aware already, is a recent episode at Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch is, I think, it's an international human rights organization. I think it's a very valuable resource. I think it is generally been run with integrity, but like anything else, it's subject to political pressures from without and within. Uh, Pressures from without are often reflected within, and um, the Israel-Palestine staff has resigned. It's two people, but they have resigned from HRW because they spent quite a bit of time putting together a paper that argues that Israel's denial of the right of return to Palestinian refugees is a crime against humanity. And that paper went through apparently 7 months of Human Rights Watch's normal vetting process. There were difficult questions asked, difficult discussions had. I understand there were edits made, feedback given. And in the end, all the relevant departments at Human Rights Watch signed off, and but their new executive director pulled the report just before it was going to be published, and that led to the resignations. I have an article at Cutting Through, which I will put the link to that in the description, so you can read more in depth what happened there and what it means. But I want to talk here um, about the right of return itself, because I think it's really interesting that this has come up at Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch, their position has been for decades. Their position has been that Palestinian refugees have the right to return. It is not a position that they have talked about a lot. Um, it's not one they've shown a big spotlight on, but that has been their position. So it's not that Human Rights Watch officially takes a stand against, or at least up to date, has officially taken a stand against the Palestinian right of return. I think the question here was whether the denial of that right rises to the question of crime against humanity. And again, that's I haven't seen the report. I haven't seen the argument that's made in it. So, that's not what this video is about. But the whole incident, I think, points up how difficult and how sticky the question of right of return is, and why it's something that nobody wants to deal with. Um, for with of course the exception of Palestinians. Everybody else wants to bury it, and I mean everybody. Nobody wants to really take this issue on except for the Palestinians and to the Palestinian people. And I think and this is what gets lost, of course, as so many things always do. To the Palestinians, this isn't just one on a laundry list of issues. With settlements and compensation and even big issues like apartheid and Jerusalem. This particular issue, the return of refugees, this is literally the core of Palestinian national identity. This is the absolute roots, the kishkis of Palestinian identity. It goes back, and many of you have probably seen stories about Palestinian families who still have the keys to the homes that they were driven out of or forced to flee from during the 1948 war, during the Nakba. Um, so it is, an utterly central issue for Palestinians, and I have argued for years that the the decision to conveniently ignore it or pretend with a nod and a wink that Palestinians know that this right will never be realized is not only false, but it's a recipe for disaster. If we ever actually get to a place where many of these issues are dealt with and resolved, and some kind of future, some kind of compromise, some kind of livable future is mapped out for Palestinians where they are free and Israelis agree to it in one way or another. Um, then the refugee issue comes up, it'll blow the whole thing up. I mean, all of that work, that would be quite a tragedy, I think, if because right now it's so hard to imagine that we could ever get to that point, and if we did, without dealing with the question of Palestinian refugees, or thinking that that's just not really an issue on the table, um, it'll blow the whole thing up. It'll blow up that entire agreement. It will make it bring us all back to square one, and wouldn't that just be, an unimaginable tragedy? And I think so. We need to look at what this question is. So for Palestinians, I've just explained how central this is to Palestinian national identity. But more than that, Palestinians, in terms of their case for return, they have international law on their side. The UN General Assembly Resolution 194 of 1949 provides that Israel should allow any Palestinians to return to their homes, provided that they were willing to, live in peace and et cetera, et cetera. And Israel, of course, never implemented that, although they did verbally agree to do so during the process of them being admitted to the United Nations. Um, and I think this is obviously justice. Some pro-Israel advocates argue and say, well, if Palestinians can return to Israel, shouldn't uh, Jewish people? I mean, I don't think anybody any Israeli citizen, possibly whose family is from Iraq, thinks of themselves as a refugee. But shouldn't those people then be allowed to return to Iraq? And I say yes, they should. They should be allowed to return to Iraq and live in safety and peace there. Yes, they should. I have no problem with that. But whether they are or not has nothing to do with whether the Palestinians should be able to return to their home. They're two separate issues. They're not tied in some way together. There's a principle, and I think the principle should be applied to every refugee, but or every descendant of refugees, or anybody who was, who wants to go back to live to a place that they consider their homeland. I think people should be allowed to do that. Um, But the fact that it's denied to one group doesn't mean that it's okay to deny it to another. So that's just an a ridiculous argument. And frankly, maybe there are some Mizrahim in Israel and elsewhere who would like to return to those to the places that their families came from before 1948. I've not met them, um, but they can exist, and if that is what they want, then I think they should be allowed to do so. But it has nothing to do with the right of Palestinians to return to Palestine. So, and the denial of the right of return to Palestinians hurts all Palestinians, all of them. One of the points that was raised by the former executive director of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, in a Democracy Now! Interview that I watched earlier today, I'll link to that in the description as well, is that the material damage done by the denial of return is very different for different Palestinians, which is on its face true. Um, certainly the damage that is done to a Palestinian living under serious restrictions in Lebanon, or living trying to survive a genocide in Gaza, that cannot go back to perhaps the homes they were driven out of in Haifa. Um, that is certainly a different situation than even than Palestinians who live in Jordan, for example, with full rights of citizenship there, and certainly Palestinians who may be, doing quite well for themselves in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere. So the material damage may be different, but it hurts all of them. If you're a Palestinian American, um, who is doing well, you have a nice house in some suburb and make a good living, and et cetera, et cetera. It's still a major harm that you can't go back to your home in Palestine. In many cases, Israel won't even allow you to visit, and certainly they won't allow you to move there. That is a significant harm. Does it rise to the level of crime against humanity? Again, I can't answer for what is in this report that Human Rights Watch has sidelined. Um, the argument Ken Roth makes in the Democracy Now! Interviews that it does not in all cases, and that's why the report needs to be more nuanced. That's his argument. I don't know how valid it is, and I don't think it matters in practice, because again, the denial of return to Palestinians hurts all Palestinians. It may not hurt all Palestinians equally, but that's true of many crimes against entire peoples. That they don't hurt them all equally. I mean, the occupation itself, the apartheid system itself in Israel is multifaceted and multi-layered. The apartheid system that Israel maintains does not hurt a Palestinian, for example, living in Nazareth the same way it hurts a Palestinian living in Hebron. So what? Does that make it any less of an apartheid system? Does that make apartheid any less of a crime? I'm not sure I understand that argument. But again, no. Uh, that is uh, that is all, that's what the debate within Human Rights Watch, I guess, is about. Um, but whether you're talking to a Palestinian in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in the United States, in France, in Britain, in Germany, wherever, in Australia, in Chile, in Mexico, wherever you want to talk, they are all denied the return, and they all, at least in my experience, find that denial painful. And I think every collective Palestinian statement that I've ever seen that talks at all about refugees, and very great many of them do, never fail to affirm the right of return. This is important. It is, again, as I said, fundamental to Palestinian national identity. So, from the Israeli point of view, the right of return is a fundamental and, yes, existential threat to the Jewish state. When Israelis talk about the Palestinians wanting the quote unquote destruction of Israel, some of the lunatics really think that involves guns and shooting and bombs and killing. Most Israelis know, whether some admit it, some don't. Most Israelis know that what they're really talking about is the right of return, is the fact that if they actually allowed Palestinians to return, and more than likely, many refugees would not choose to move to Palestine, um, given the choice. They have lives elsewhere, but many probably would. And it is a virtual certainty that it would mean the evaporation, probably pretty quickly, of the Jewish majority in Israel. And that is what is perceived as the destruction of the Jewish state. That is what people are thinking of. So when you hear that and you hear the terror in Israelis' voices, it's the right of return that they're scared of. That really is true. And this isn't about the Ben Gvirniks and the Likudniks. This is across the Israeli political spectrum, including liberal Zionists, including even some who would identify as post-Zionist or non-Zionist. There is a cadre of anti-Zionist Israelis who would support the right of return, but that is a very small uh, number in Israel, and even many anti-Zionists in Israel, religious ones, would not be supportive of seeing hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of Palestinians from all over the world suddenly move into Israel. So, you can see where this touches on a certain fear, but it's more even than that, because even talking about the right of return brings up some very, very uncomfortable issues for not only Israelis but also supporters of Israel. Um, it shines a light. The entire concept of the return of refugees shines a light on the fact that the Jewish majority in Israel is engineered. It is an engineered and artificially created and artificially maintained Jewish majority. How did there get to be a Jewish majority? The initial partition plan, as many people know, that the UN proposed in 1947, would have seen an Israel that would have been whose population would have been 55% Jewish and 45% Arab. So there would have been a majority, but the Israelis at that time were no fools, and they understood that if they accepted that kind of demographic, uh, they would lose the majority within a generation or two, probably just within one. In the event, what happened, and as a result of the Nakba, the territory that became Israel was its borders were changed. And the population, the entire population, Jewish and non-Jewish, of Israel in 1948 was, according to Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics, 872,700 people. Out of those, 82% were Jewish, 18% non-Jewish, pretty much all Palestinian Arab, Druze, Circassian, the same mix of folks that you have now. That stands in stark contrast to 1947, just a year earlier, where the Jewish population made up 32% of Palestine, and that, of course, is with a significant influx of Jewish refugees from Europe, and of course that number would grow after the creation of the State of Israel. The Jewish population stayed and reached the upper 80% in the 60s. And these days it's around 76%, 76, 77% Jewish And in order to do that, as we know over the years, Israel has, gone to great lengths to encourage Jews to move to Israel, to bring in people who were Jewish, sometimes not so Jewish. There was a lot of controversy over the people who, when the Soviet Union dissolved, many Russians came in who were not necessarily Jewish. Many of them were not Jewish at all. Many of them were not Jewish according to Jewish law, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and there's a lot of controversies around that, but it all depends, of course, on maintaining a high proportion of Jews through Aliyah, which is Jews moving to Israel, and of course, barring the return of Palestinian refugees. Now, the Palestinian population of Israel itself, which was 156,000 in 1948, is now up to about 2.4 million. This is just the citizens of Israel. Okay, so this doesn't include the non-Jewish. Well, it does include the non-Jewish population of East Jerusalem, but obviously it does not include the West Bank. It includes the Golan Heights, which is relatively sparsely populated. Um, so out of a total population of 10 million, you have about 23.5% right now who are not Jewish. That changes radically, and it is maintained by a lot of efforts to limit limit Palestinian rights. And when we consider, this is exactly why, when we talk about a one-state solution, why Israelis hate it so much, this is why, because you don't have a Jewish majority, and the Jewish population of Israel wants a Jewish majority. It is their most comfortable, although it's not an actual legal argument, against the fact that it's an apartheid state. You can be apartheid and still be the majority. Apartheid does not mean minority rule. It means two different laws for two different groups of people. Um, and the argument is that, well, we have Jewish majority and it's all democratically elected, and the non-Jewish population can vote and can be politically active. Won't get into all of that, and how threadbare many of those arguments are, but it's this is what Israeli Jews and their supporters around the world find so worrisome about the right of return, because the right of return not only threatens that Jewish majority, but it threatens the idea that that Jewish majority has to be maintained in some way. Natural evolution of the populations do not point toward the maintaining of a Jewish majority. You have to bring in, without the influx of Jews, Jewish immigration or airlifts or outreach by Israel to bring Jews into the country, and with a natural population growth of the Palestinian minority, there would not be a Jewish majority within a few generations. The fact that it's gone down from a high of what, almost 89% in 1960, down to where it is now, which is around 76.5%, already shows you um, the demographic realities. And of course, there's other issues there as well. But these are uncomfortable conversations for Israeli Jews to have. They don't want to have those conversations. They want to have the it is important to them, and it's important. We can be cynical and talk about its importance for propaganda purposes, but I think there's a real and a genuine importance to a lot of Israeli Jews and their supporters, that Israel be not just Jewish but democratic. That it be those two things. Now, there are many of us, myself included, who think those two things are incompatible, fundamentally incompatible. You cannot be an ethnocratic state and a democracy. You cannot be a state of only one ethnicity and not a state of its citizens, and call yourself a democracy. And even if you pass laws that seem to promote that equality, it's fleeting. They get reversed because nationalism in an ethnocracy is going to overwhelm that. So, um, that is why this is such a serious concern. Now, when we talk about the issue of Palestinian refugees, and I've talked to many Palestinians about this, um, and I get a variety of answers, as far as, how to proceed. I mean, there are certainly those, like many other, like, on many points of this conflict, who say, look, this is our right. It is an absolute right. We are not going to compromise at all, and Israel's just going to have to accept it. I mean, I can't say that's unfair. A right is a right. On the other hand, there are political realities. Um, and um, many Palestinians I've talked to understand that there are political realities that they have to deal with. That they won't compromise. Even those folks that I've talked to, on the whole, will not compromise on the idea that it is their absolute right to return. They were willing to talk about various ways that that right can be implemented. And I think, I think that's a reasonable stance, but I think also how that right is pursued is completely up to Palestinians and is their decision to make. Palestinians will have a political calculus to make. We have this right. The overwhelming political, diplomatic, and frankly economic and military power is leveled against us having actually using this right. So what do we do about that? That is a tactical question that only Palestinians can answer. And whatever their answer to that is their own decision, and then will need to be brought into some conversation with the Israelis. Israelis are not going to just go away, and there's nothing. It would be historically, globally unprecedented to see, Israel being forced by the rest of the world to just say you have to listen to whatever the Palestinians want. That's just unrealistic in my mind. What is realistic is that the Palestinians have their perspective, the Israelis have their perspective, and you bring it into international fora, and you talk it through, and you work it out as you work out every other issue. You do that in an international forum where the international community's role is to make sure that those two groups are speaking on an equal basis. Okay, so that means, yes, bolstering the Palestinian position in some way, not in terms of taking their side in the debate, but bolstering it so that Israel has to negotiate this question in good faith and have these conversations in good faith and see where that goes. Um, I don't see what else the international community can do, but that's not what's happening. Instead, what's happening is, even the most liberal, and it's not just even, again, I'm going to say it's not just liberal Zionists, it's liberals in general, um, who may not consider themselves Zionists at all, may consider themselves even-handed or whatever you want to call it. But they all have kind of come together to say, well, Palestinians know that the right of return can't be implemented. They'll accept that if we just, say some nice words or acknowledge that there's a problem and offer them compensation. And I do think compensation is probably going to be part of whatever package can end up satisfying the Palestinian people, but the Palestinian people will have to be satisfied. And I don't, I think people are kidding themselves if they think Palestinians are ready to just give up the right of return. One of the reasons, and again, no one wants to talk about this, one of the reasons that the Oslo Accords fell apart at Camp David in 2000 and that whole discussion could not happen, is that there had been real no real conversation about the right of return. And Yasser Arafat, who gets blamed for supposedly blowing, not, for refusing Barak's generous offer. Arafat went to that conference saying, I'm going on the condition that you guys don't end up blaming me. And the reason that he knew he would end up getting blamed is because There had been no national conversation among Palestinians of how do we approach this question of the right of return. They can, he could have gone in and pretended, which is, I think, the net result of what he did, although I don't think this was his intent, uh, um, to basically go along with this idea that Palestinians will just, accept 5,000 refugees coming back into what is now Israel, and will, be satisfied with that and some compensation. Um, which was just, it was never a conversation that was happening. And it was perceived by Palestinians at the time. I was there. I'm remembering this. I was following this very closely. It was perceived by Palestinians at the time as selling out the right of return. And he wasn't saying this in Palestine. He wasn't saying it in Arabic. This is what I think, got communicated at Camp David. And Arafat knew it was a no-go. He knew he couldn't agree to it. And that's why he knew it wasn't going to work. So again, proving my point. I mean, this refusal to deal with the right of return will only blow up whatever agreements can possibly be reached. And I'm not saying that had there been a way forward on the question of refugees that the Camp David proposals would have worked, although the later ones at Taba might have made more sense with some piece of that, really dealing with the refugees. It seems for right now an insoluble problem. It is an immovable object, which is the Israelis' refusal, standing against an irresistible force, which is the Palestinian core national identity that involves the right of return, that it depends on the right of return. And how those things, get resolved, it all, it remains to be seen. I don't have the answer to that, but I do know that ignoring the problem is not going to help. And that's what we're doing right now. And I think that's part of what blew up at Human Rights Watch. I don't know. I'm not inside, but it certainly seems to me that that is what it looks like what happened. That people are afraid, people in Human Rights Watch are much better informed. They know that that bringing up the idea that of the right of return in and of itself is going to spark an immense backlash from Israel, the United States, Europe, etc., and that is going to be magnified by saying the denial of that right is a crime against humanity. And I think that's, so it all grows out of this refusal to talk about it. We need to talk about it. We need to deal with it. It needs to be part of the conversation, whether you believe in one state, two states, whatever. It needs to be part of the conversation. And right now, except for, among Palestinians, it's not. And that has to change. So again, I'll link to the relevant articles in the description, and we will see what happens moving forward. And I will be talking to you again soon.